Hey guys, hope everyone's doing well. This video is a response to a request made by one of our students to break down the just war theory and apply that to Sri Lanka in the context of the civil war. Please keep in mind that the opinions expressed in this video are my own and are not to be misinterpreted in any way as those of my employers or my colleagues or any individual really other than myself. Uh, Let me first give you guys a brief overview of what exactly the just war theory is. It's a doctrine or a legal theory, very much a part of military ethics, but now becoming a strong component of international humanitarian law as well, which states that there are some circumstances under which a state is justified in resorting to force or in waging a war against another state or a non state actor or an entity of some sort. For a state to lay claim to this just war doctrine, there are three things it has to satisfy: jus ad bellum, which is the right to go to war; jus in bello, which is just and responsible conduct during war; and jus post bellum, which is just and responsible conduct after the war. So basically, for a state to legitimize a war that it's just waged under international law, it has to satisfy three things. One, that it had a legitimate reason to go to war. Two, that it conducted itself legally and responsibly during that war. And number three, that it's conducting itself justly and responsibly after the war, perhaps by fostering an atmosphere of reconciliation and justice and peace and things like that. I'm not going to get into the technicalities of the three components here because anyone can get that in any law of armed conflict textbook. What I will do instead is apply that to the Sri Lankan context. Now, once again, I'd like to reassert that this isn't meant to be a political video of any sort, nor was it made at the behest of any vested interest. It's simply one person, me, giving his legal opinion on the matter. Was Sri Lanka's war against the LTT a just one under international law? Does it satisfy the criteria of the just war theory? At the outset, let me state that I feel it was just and legal, and that it does satisfy the just war theory. So if you're one of the many people who can't stomach that perspective, then this is your cue to close the window and stop watching the video. With that out of the way, let me now go through these three components and apply them to the war. The first one, jus ad bellum, or the right to go to war, I think is the least controversial and certainly the least contested of the lot, because not even Sri Lanka's critics argue that a state shouldn't have the right to defend itself against an insurgent group. Because after all, this is no longer a debated notion. It's an international reality that states will respond against armed rebels with force, especially a group like the LTT, which had a navy and air force and a conventional army as well. Uh, I think this is particularly true in the South Asian context, if you look at it, because Sri Lanka's closest and largest neighbor, India, is a state that's plagued with insurgencies from the Naxalites today to the Khalistan movement in the 80s. So as far as the first component goes, I don't think it's very controversial to conclude that the Sri Lankan government was right to wage war against an armed insurgent group, and that this does come under the just war theory. It gets tricky when we come to the second one, jus in bello, because this is where most of the controversy stems from. Was the conduct of the Sri Lankan army just or responsible? Of course, critics of the state, and particularly remnants of the LTT among the diaspora, often point out the death toll in the last few days to weave accusations of genocide and ethnic cleansing and things like that. Of course, these people often give me the impression that they have no idea what the legal definitions of genocide and ethnic cleansing even are, but that's perhaps for a different video. In my judgment, the key question here is, was the massive death toll, which was a human tragedy, there's no doubt about that, was that a consequence of the Sri Lankan government deliberately targeting civilians? Was that because there was an intentional policy to kill non-combatants? I don't think so. I really don't think so. And in fact, if you look at any objective scholar on this, and here I could recommend to our students and our audience Narayan Swami's excellent trilogy on this, and even Nitin Gokale's book on the last few days of the war. No objective analyst has ever claimed that there was some kind of intentional policy to target and kill civilians. To the contrary, however, It's widely acknowledged today that had it not been for the LTT dragging such a mass chunk of civilians with them, forcibly at gunpoint to serve as their human shields, then the civilian death toll would have been a fraction, a minor fraction of what we eventually incurred. And I think thus any moral or legal culpability must be borne by the LTTE and not by the Sri Lankan army, because after all, it's the entity that deliberately places civilians in the line of fire for them to die that must be held responsible for their deaths, not an entity under whose actions they died because of collateral damage. One could, of course, counter argue by saying, look, the government's decision to annihilate the LTT anyway, despite knowing that it would result in large civilian casualties, shows that their war was not just, that their conduct was not responsible. But my response to that would be, we've then got to see what any other society or army would have done in the same circumstances. And it's only if what the Sri Lankan government did was a significant departure from what the rest would have done, only then could we then get into further arguments about war crimes and genocide and things like that. Now here again, I think the history of counterinsurgency is on the side of the state, because no state or army under those circumstances in any part of the world, in any conflict, would have capitulated at that climactic moment. Really, and given the insurgents a reprieve to regather, or even worse, to escape permanently. So here too, I think it could certainly be argued that while the war ended in a devastating human tragedy, which can't really be denied, the conduct of the Sri Lankan army, I think it must be said, was not responsible for it. And that there's nothing in the way that the war was conducted per se which would outright disqualify the army from the jus in bello component, because ultimately, if what the Sri Lankan army did was precisely what anyone else from the USA to China to India to Russia would have done, then it can't really be called illegal in any kind of meaningful sense, because this is military reality, this is military necessity, and sometimes we've got to look at those two when we judge the legality or illegality of something. Which brings us to the third component, which is also tricky, jus post bellum, conduct after the war. There are certain issues that come from this as well. And here too, I think it's amazing how much progress has been achieved on the ground, and yet how the picture painted by the media and by vested interests abroad have succeeded in giving people the completely opposite impression. Let's look at a few facts here. In terms of clearing out landmines put up by the LTT in civilian zones, in terms of rehabilitating ex-combatants and reintroducing them to society, in terms of resettling the tens of thousands who were displaced in the civil war, the Sri Lankan government is light years ahead of what any other nation has accomplished in a post-war scenario, especially a post-war scenario on this scale. So this should not be downplayed at any point. I raised this with Ms. Suhasini Haidar as well, who was our guest on the first episode of our podcast, and she thought it was incredible too, this dichotomy. There's a great deal of economic investment in the north today, which we need to talk about. Even the president of the Asian Development Bank, who was in Colombo from Hong Kong a few months ago, publicly stated how impressed he was with the economic resurgence in the north. In terms of linguistic and cultural reconciliation, the president himself has launched a trilingual policy, and a great deal of money and manpower and effort has been put into ensuring that the present school-going generation is trilingual, meaning when the kids who go to school today are adults and decision makers 10-15 years down the line, almost all of them would be conversant in English, Tamil and Sinhala, which I think is spectacular. And even as far as the political settlement goes, though a lot of people do criticize it, we've got to be realistic about these things. The TNA is in power now in both the north and the east. There are democratic leaders who are the ones running the show, and whatever else you might say about the structures in place and the amendments that are required to decentralize power, the fact that something like this could have happened just 5 years after the war, even within 5 years from the day the war ended, is incredible, and it has to be celebrated. The only valid skepticism and criticism I've heard on this issue is that there has to be more of a focus on justice. So while the government's narrative and policies have all focused on moving ahead and looking to the future as a united Sri Lanka, some feel that some amount of time and energy must also be spent on looking at past misconduct and at making sure that those responsible for that must be held accountable and punished. Now, I kind of agree with that, but then again, this comes down to a disagreement on prioritizing reconciliation and accountability against each other, rather than outright denying that no effort has been made to ensure peace and harmony. So I think here as well, for the reasons that I've just listed, under the third component as well, I think the Sri Lankan government and the Sri Lankan situation more than adequately falls under the just war theory. So yeah, so these are the three components, and this is why I think Sri Lanka's conduct during, before and after the war is perfectly legal and legitimate under international law. There are of course many issues which I haven't touched in the interest of time, like the UNHRC resolution and the point by point allegations made against the state, and maybe even the LLRC report, which might have been useful. So hopefully I can touch on those on a video somewhere down the line, or maybe in the course of our conversations with different people, these issues will inevitably come up. So if you guys agree with us and like what we do, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel. If you don't like what we say and hate what we do, please give us a like and subscribe to our channel nonetheless. Make sure that you tell all your friends about us, and please keep checking up on our channel, because we do plan to bring you content on a very regular basis, and we will be bringing you lots of conversations and debates and discussions. So thanks guys, take care, and until next time.